So hello and welcome, and thank you for joining this rather special meeting. It's special for a number of reasons, but for one reason in particular, which is it's the first joint meeting of the Sussex, Kent and Hampshire Ornithological Societies and the Surrey Bird Club. So a very warm welcome to members of all those organisations, and indeed anyone who lives in any of those counties and who is not a member. If you aren't a member, do think about joining the relevant society. So we're very fortunate in having as our guest speaker this evening Dr. Mark Eaton. He is the principal conservation scientist at the RSPB and plays a leading role in the monitoring of birds in the United Kingdom to inform and enhance national conservation objectives. And he also has responsibility for monitoring some birds overseas in dependent territories, and is also active with European partners on a European scale. He's clearly got a very busy, demanding and responsible job, but he does other things as well as all that, and one of them is the subject of his talk tonight, which is he's the secretary of the Rare Breeding Birds panel for the UK. And those of us who are involved with this panel know that it must be a very, very demanding job on its own, because there's a huge amount of data that comes in from the counties and quite a lot of work goes into chasing them up, I suspect. Hopefully not the counties that are attending here tonight. But without further ado, let me pass over to Mark for his talk on the work of the Rare Breeding Birds panel.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you for the opportunity to come and talk to such a large gathering across four counties. And I should start by saying that no, I don't have any problems in receiving data on rare breeding birds from those four counties. We get excellent support from the bird clubs and societies and their recorders and teams. So I'll clear that up for the start. I do, however, have to point out to either Mark or Tim that you need to enable screen sharing, because I'm being told at the moment I can't yet.
Sorry, that's my fault.
No problem.
Are we good to go? You should be able to now.
We are now. Right. Thank you very much, Mark. So through the magic of Zoom, hopefully within seconds, you should be able to see my slides.
That's great.
And I'll move them into screen show. Hopefully that'll come through. It's taking a second with me, as these usually do. There we are, and we've flipped forward a slide already. Yes, so thank you very much for the opportunity to talk. I'm going to talk about the monitoring of rare breeding birds in the UK, particularly, specifically the work of the Rare Breeding Birds panel, as Mark has already mentioned. So a little bit of structure to what I'm going to talk to through this evening. I'm going to start by selling the work that the Rare Breeding Birds panel does to you and the purpose for it and the value of it, and hopefully persuade you it's worth doing. I'm then going to talk about the panel itself, move on to just to talk about some of its results, particularly around our last report, which was the 2018, show you some results and highlights from that. And then whenever I give these talks, I always move to the bit at the end, which is really payback for you for sort of having given the talk, trying to encourage people to support the work of the Rare Breeding Birds panel by looking for rare breeding birds and submitting the records to help us. So I'll talk about that within South East England. So first bit, trying to sell our work. The Rare Breeding Bird panel, through collating records on rare breeding birds across the UK on an annual basis, is able to produce population estimates and trends in many of our rarest breeding bird species. So these are really valuable for the important role of setting conservation priorities, because I'm sure you'll appreciate we don't have, the RSPB and other conservation organisations don't have all the resources we'd want to conserve every species all the time, everywhere. So it's very important we prioritise, identify the most important places and species to work on. One way we do that is through our Birds of Conservation Concern assessments. So at periods of about every 6 years, taking all that data we have on both common and rare breeding birds, all the UK's regularly occurring species, and assessing that against a set of set criteria, looking at population declines and abundance and so forth, and putting species on to either the red, amber or green list. The last time we did this was in 2015. That was Birds of Conservation Concern 4. You see curlew, not actually a rare breeding bird yet, hopefully never will be, went onto the red list. We're currently working on a revision of this. There'll be a new Birds of Conservation Concern published at the end of this year. And that data collected by the rare breeding birds is crucial in these assessments. The last red list, 60 of the 67 red listed species, 22 of them were rare breeders that were red listed using data from the panel's work. The data we collect also enables research, and sometimes that can be on issues and on species of concern or pressures that are facing many species. Just an example here of looking at the impacts of probably climate change, I should say, on the distribution of quail. The graph on the right there shows the average latitude of singing male quails reported to the rare breeding bird panel over the last 3 decades or so. And those blue dots moving diagonally up that graph indicate that the average latitude, how far north quail are moving in the UK, has shifted up at about 5 kilometres a year northwards using the data we've collected, demonstrating something happening there. We believe the change of climate change as it's working on many species changing distributions. Our database is also crucial for other types of conservation, for example, identifying sites that are particularly important to rare breeding birds. Our archive underpinned assessments of the UK's SPA network, that Special Protection Area network, these designated sites all across the UK. It's enabled those sites to be identified for designation in the first place, so they get that additional protection to look after the rare species there for golden eagles and red-throated divers and dotterel, for example, and also to assess that network over time and see whether those protected areas are actually doing their stated job of protecting species, whether the populations there are indeed holding up because the sites are being properly managed or not. And finally, one of the important roles we play is assessing the impact of conservation, of site designation, of prioritising species and doing research and trying to help them. And so from time to time, we get species where we have these very satisfying graphs, and I've got a few a bit later in the talk, such as red kites, where you can see the recovery of this species. When the panel first started collecting data, it was nearly extinct in the UK, just a few pairs left in a few remote Welsh valleys. There was a slow recovery you can see on that graph, and then the reintroduction programs late in the last century began to kick in, and we saw this huge increase. And of course, you shouldn't be alarmed by the end of that graph. That shows the point at which red kites became too common for us really to be able to count all of them and catch up with them all every year. And then we reached the point where we stopped considering it a rare breeding bird, and it was no longer the RBBP's job to collect data on it. So that's some of the things that we're good for, and there are a whole range of other purposes and ways we help conservation. I should say at this point that our work is really part of a partnership. It's a partnership with organisations, funding organisations, the RSPB and JNCC, so UK government in particular, support the work of the Rare Breeding Birds Panel financially. The BTO provides some support as well, but other governmental agencies and other NGOs are very involved in the RBBP's work. And then of course there's the vital role that bird clubs and societies play in supporting our work, and the teams that work within them in helping the RBBP. And then the other part of the partnership, which I use this rather strange slide to demonstrate, is the huge network, the huge numbers of birdwatchers we have in the UK. You probably don't recognise this, but this is the city ground. This is Nottingham Forest's ground. I don't show it because I'm a fan of Nottingham Forest, far from it, but it just so happens it holds 19,000 people. Well, it will do when people have to go back to football matches. 19,000 people can fit in there, a huge crowd. That's the same number of people that collected data and submitted data to the BTO's last bird atlas in the UK and Ireland, the 2007-11 bird atlas. About 19,000 people submitted data. It's a huge number. You need a football ground to hold the number of enthusiastic, dedicated and expert volunteers we have in the UK, collecting data, in a whole range of surveys supporting our monitoring work. And we're really lucky to be able to call upon that. It's quite possible that birds in the UK are the best monitored taxonomic group anywhere in the world. Possible the Dutch might give us a run for the money in terms of their bird monitoring. It's very good as well, but yeah, we have some of the best monitoring for sure. And we're really lucky that we're able to call on that to support our work. So the Rare Breeding Birds Panel, this is what it is. It's an independent body that was founded in late 1972 and has reported on rare breeding birds in the UK from 1973 onwards, so nearly 50 years worth. Like I say, it's independent, but its work, which is basically the work of the professional secretary, that's me, is funded by the RSPB and JCC, with, as I said, some support from the BTO. The panel itself, which at the moment is 9 people, are volunteers. They're volunteers from a range of roles, county bird recorders, keen bird ringers, representatives of some of the organisations involved with the panel, with a whole range of expertise on species and types of monitoring and so forth. Many decades of experience that we can call on to inform the work of the panel and steer its work. And then, as I mentioned, me doing most of that work. What the panel does is collate data on rare breeding birds in the UK. We don't direct work as such. We don't employ people to go out and survey birds. We play a role collating data that's collected by others. We work to encourage improvements in their monitoring. That's one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you this evening. We maintain this archive, a secure archive, which we make available with very strong constraints and security around it for conservation and research purposes. We produce annual reports showing how populations of rare breeding birds are doing. And we have a website with lots of information, far more than I'll talk about this evening. So the things I don't cover, the questions you don't get to ask, go and look at our website. So, important for me to define what a rare breeding bird is in our definition. The RBPP defines this as species with populations of less than 2,000 breeding pairs in the UK, of which there are around 80 regularly breeding in the country. There are another longer list of up to 100 species which occasionally breed or just show signs of attempting to breed. So some of those 100, in fact, many of those 100 have never actually bred, but they may be species for which they've established territories in the past, of being singing males. They may be, for example, great reed warblers, for which many years there'll be a singing great reed warbler trying to attract a mate somewhere in the UK. As yet, none of them have been successful to our knowledge, but it may happen in the future. And we collect data on these species because, of course, they may be the forerunners of future colonizations. And we also record and report upon non-native breeding species, those with populations of less than 300 pairs. And there's a list of about 20 species, non-native species, which regularly breed in the UK. So just some examples, and we do classify our list. We put it in, break it down into smaller classes. So at the sort of commoner end, we've got species such as the egret. We call that a less scarce breeder, with those with populations of between 1,000 and 2,000 pairs. Moving down, what we call scarce breeders, between 300 and 1,000 pairs, pochard being an example of that. Some of these species on the sort of upper end of our list might not strike people as particularly rare species, particularly in some parts of the country. Little egrets, for example, pochard and ducks like shoveler, which is also on our list, often don't strike bird watchers as something they should be recording, particularly as they're, depending where you are in the country, used to seeing them in reasonable numbers in the winter. And so they maybe overlook them, forget that there's any great interest in them when they see them maybe in the same place in May, which is a good sign that they might be attempting to breed. So we have to sort of remind people that we're interested in these species. As we get to rarer species, our rare breeder category between 30 and 300 pairs, I think this is more obvious, and most bird watchers will appreciate things like black-throated divers with probably around 180 pairs in the UK is genuinely a rare breeding bird. Then we get down to our very rare breeders, something like marsh warblers, so species with less than 30 pairs. In fact, marsh warblers are considerably rarer than that most years. And then this group I mentioned before, these species which only occasionally breed or never have, but may have attempted. Common rosefinch is a slightly unusual example because there was a period a few decades ago where they started getting commoner. They were spreading west across Europe. It looked like we were on the verge of a colonization. Since then, that range has now shifted away across Europe, and they really are a very, very rare breed. And in fact, most years we only maybe have 1 or 2 singing males. And just a nice colourful photo of a golden pheasant to remind you, repeat the fact that we cover non-native birds. Often reporting of non-native rare breeding birds is very poor. They tend to get overlooked, disregarded by birdwatchers, not of great interest, and so we don't get as many records as we'd like. So, as I mentioned, the RBPP collates work. We don't really go out and collect. Unfortunately, it is not my job to spend the spring and summer roaming around looking for rare breeding birds. That's a great pity. So we rely on the work of others. So professional conservationists, those working on reserves, for example, scientists, what I've called here specialist amateurs, so bird ringers in particular, those who study particular species, maybe raptor enthusiasts, and then bird watchers. And actually bird watchers is the most important group. About 70% of the records we receive come in from just birdwatching activity, not directly from the birdwatchers themselves, but via their bird clubs and societies. So submitted to their county bird club, organized by their county bird recorder or the team that assists he or she, and then passed on to us. So every year, these, as you can see in this schematic, these different sources of data are out there, seeing birds, working on birds, ringing them or whatever, and the data flows in for, ringing data comes via the BTO. Data collected through Schedule 1 licensed activities might come through the government agencies. And at the top, that most important data flow, records submitted by birdwatchers to the county bird recorders and then flowing to us. All this data comes into me in the middle, and from that I maintain our database and produce annual reports, which is there. And here, this is our most recent annual report published in the Journal of British Birds, as it always is. The last one was in December 2020. There's a time lag. It does take time for these data flows to reach the RBPP and then for us to analyse the data and produce reports. So our report late in 2020 was on 2018. And you can see that I'm particularly pleased to see this, the black-necked grebe, on the cover of this report because it's the logo of the Rare Breeding Bird Panel. So now I'll move on and just show you some of the contents, show you some of the results that were shared in that 2018 report, just on a small selection of species. So one example, quail. Now, one of the overriding stories in the 2018 report was actually the number of species doing well, rare breeding bird species doing well in the UK, but quail wasn't one. You can see the graph here. There's lots of graphs in any talk I ever give. The blue line there shows the total of birds reported. It's usually singing males for quail, rarely sort of confirmed breeding because they're so secretive. And you can see at the end of that for 2018, it's actually the lowest total of quail reported for any year since 1991, so nearly 30 years worth. And in fact, the third worst year for quail ever in the time we've covered it. The quail hasn't been reported on for the whole lifespan of the RBPP. It joined our list in 1986 when we changed. We added some of the less scarce species on. So a really bad year for quail, but not something to particularly get too worried about, because you'll see, and I'm sure many of you will know, quail show these remarkable fluctuations in their numbers migrating north to breed in the UK every year, with periodic quail years. And you can see two very obvious quail years in 87 and 2011 on that graph, those two big peaks. And as well as those big peaks, we see considerable troughs. We don't necessarily understand the drivers behind all of this, but we can see that 2018 was a very bad year. I know already from the work I've been doing on the 2019 data, working on our next report, quails did very well in 2019, actually had a considerable hike in numbers. So no long-term concern for quail there. But moving on to those genuine good news stories. And there are, like I say, there were 10 species for which we reported higher numbers than ever before in the duration of the nearly 50 years of RBBP recording. And in fact, for some of these species, for many years before that, because we know, of course, that the cranes, for example, were extinct for decades. But that's the trend for cranes. You can see the return of the species as a breeding species in the UK was in 1981, where the first pair started breeding in the Norfolk Broads, and for many years that was all we had, a very small population in the Norfolk Broads just hanging on. A gradual increase, and then around the turn of the century a more steady increase and an expansion across East Anglia into sites in the Fens, moving west, and then up to Yorkshire, and then up to northeast Scotland. So a great expansion of the range. And then the sort of orangey yellow line on there shows the impact of the Great Crane project. The reintroduction project started in the West Country 10 years ago, and how after a delay for birds to establish themselves and reach breeding age, we've seen the population there shoot up and contribute to this steady increase in UK cranes. And in fact, we've now got the situation where birds from the west, from the reintroduction, and birds from the growing population in the east are meeting in the middle, and there are mixed pairs of birds in the Midlands. So a great conservation story there. Another species which not increasing at the same rate, but seems to be doing well. 2018 was the 5th year in a row for which we'd seen breeding attempts of Blackwing Stilt in the UK, often in southeast England. Essex and Kent are the most attractive counties for them. They're not always successful with this breeding. I think of the last 22 breeding attempts, only 7 have managed to raise young. Predation, cattle trampling, issues like that, but they're persevering, and we do seem to see, you know, repeated attempts, possibly the same pairs, coming back year after year. Just a bit of context for that. This is a map taken from the European Breeding Bird Atlas 2, published just before Christmas. As the 2 suggests, this is the second European Breeding Bird Atlas, and this is a map showing change since the first, for which data was collected in the mid-80s. The most recent one collected data between 2013 and 17. The grey squares, that's sort of 50 by 50 kilometre scale, those grey squares show areas which had breeding Blackwing Stilts, or Blackwing Stilts present in the breeding season at least, in both of the Atlas periods. The few orange squares are places where they were in the first but not in the second, but that swathe of blue squares show areas where Blackwing Stilts moved into since that first Atlas over the intervening 30 years. So you can see that huge area across Europe, moving north across Europe and moving inland within the continent as well. So massive expansion of the Blackwing Stilt range. And we seem to be seeing that where we are on the very edge of the range. They're just beginning to tip north into the UK. And of course, we can suspect, and we're probably right in suspecting, that climate change is the main driver behind this. It's a useful map in the context of Blackwing Stilts. It also, if I'm slightly cheeky, gives me the opportunity to advertise the wonderful book that map comes from. So the European Breeding Bird Atlas, published by Lynx Editions. It's an epic volume. Over 1,000 pages, over 5 kilos of book, accounts for over 550 species with maps of abundance, of occurrence and of change, wonderful illustrations, really fantastic and fascinating species accounts. I thoroughly recommend you look into buying a copy before it sells out. I should provide a disclaimer though, it's produced by the European Bird Census Council, and I am chairman of the European Bird Census Council, so that is not an entirely unbiased review of the book. So, you know, take it with a pinch of salt if you want. Moving on to another success, the adverts over bitterns, and of course this is quite a familiar story. I'm sure you're all aware of the recovery of bitterns over recent decades, not least because my employers in the other half of my work, the RSPB, never fail to put out a press release every year triumphing a new highest population of bitterns, just because our press officers love the bitterns are booming headlines they get every year. But here's the evidence behind that, and you can see from the blue line there that in the mid-90s our population was at a very, very low ebb. There were very few sites with bitterns left and very few booming males, down to about a dozen, I think at their lowest, most of which were in Minsmere. A programme of research, informing better site management and the creation of a lot of new wetland sites, reed bed sites, resulted in this expansion, this increase in the blue line, which shows the number of booming males, the remarkable colonization of the Somerset levels and the population there shooting up was something we really couldn't have, well, I wouldn't have predicted back then. And the red bars on this graph show the number of sites occupied, just indicating that this is not just an increase at a small number of sites holding more birds. There's been a big range expansion as part of that, not just Somerset, but moving west and north through the UK into Wales, heading up into northern England, a true conservation success. Another upturn, which maybe would have been a bit harder to predict and still puzzles me slightly, the graph of red-necked phalaropes. It's a species which has shown a remarkable upturn in the last 10 years, both in numbers shown by the blue line here, but also again, like bitten in sites, expanding its range to the extent that there's been a breeding attempt in England in recent years. So really quite a surprise, particularly as this is a species unlike Blackwing Stilt. This is a species for which the UK is at the very southern edge of its range. And with the predictions of climate change and the impacts on ranges and northward shifts of those, we might expect to be losing red-necked phalaropes rather than seeing an increase. And indeed, we see across Scandinavia, again, harking back to that atlas, the change maps from that atlas for red-necked phalaropes in Scandinavia show a great loss of range across southern Sweden, southern Finland, as the bird's range contracts north. But ours are doing okay. Possibly one of the explanations for that is the remarkable migration of red-necked phalaropes, something we've only discovered in recent years with smaller geolocated tags, which have allowed us to track the migration of these birds and other small birds like them, and find that whereas most of Europe's and in Scandinavian red-necked phalaropes migrate down to the Arabian Ocean and the Indian Ocean overland, birds from Shetland, as far as we know, as far as from those we've sampled so far, head in completely the opposite direction. And they travel across the Atlantic, they travel down the eastern seaboard of North America in a very rapid migration at the end of the breeding season, across Central America, and winter in the east of the Pacific. So off the west coast to places like Ecuador, around the Galapagos Islands. It's a remarkable migration. And when they're wintering down there, of course, they're subject to the impact of the El Nino climatic event, these cyclical events in climate down there, which affect food resources and so forth. So it may be that fluctuation we're seeing at the moment, that increase, is some impact of that and maybe cycles in the suitability of the wintering ground, rather than anything that's happening in the breeding ground. That's conjecture, we don't know that for sure, but it's quite possible. That's why we see this very different trend. Moving back to something slightly more familiar to you in the southeast of England, goshawk and other species showing a steady incline, in fact, increasing since the beginning of the RPBP in 1973. Goshawk only returned to the UK as a breeding species in the late 60s, which at the time was attributed to probably accidentally escaped falconers' birds, maybe the odd immigrant from the continent. It's become apparent with the passage of time there was nothing accidental about the return of goshawks, and most of these were deliberate, sort of under the counter reintroduction programs run by enthusiasts and falconers, which reintroduced this bird, and since then the population has steadily increased. Should stay for this. I mean, you can see we're reporting about 700 pairs of goshawk a year now. It's likely that the true population is considerably more than that, and they're not all being reported to the Rare Breeding Birds panel, either because some observers are withholding records, or indeed, a lot of the population is in remote places where they just aren't being found every year. And another very relevant for the southeast of England bird that's doing tremendously well, Mediterranean gull. So we reported a record total in 2018, largely in part to the immense number, the about 1,740 pairs at one site in Hampshire at Langston Harbour. So a massive jump in numbers there, but there are also important populations in Kent. There's quite a lot of variation and fluctuation between year to year. I know that in 2019, the population at Langston Harbour was considerably smaller, about 600 pairs. But the overall trend is there. Despite these fluctuations, it does seem that the species is steadily increasing. We can expect to take it off our species list quite soon, but because of these fluctuations, although there were over 2,000 in the last report, we will keep it on the list just for a little bit longer to make sure that it's going to be maintained at that higher level. But it's not all good news. I should show one example of a declining species, one you'll be familiar with. I mean, by the time the panel started collecting data in the early 70s, Redback Strike was already a very rare bird, having once been common and widespread. By the 80s, by the late 80s, when the last pair in East Anglia and Norfolk stopped breeding, it looked like they were on their way out completely. But you can see here, the blue line is the total every year, which includes singing males, birds that hold territory but aren't successful. But the red bars are confirmed breeding attempts. And we can see that actually, yeah, they're just about persevering. So we've not lost Redback Strike quite yet. And there is news from the near continent, for example, northern France and the Netherlands, of a resurgence of their populations, which had similarly fallen. So there is possibly some hope that we might see resurgence in the south of England. Maybe a species to keep an eye out for in your counties. And then just finally, one example, not of a large trend, but one of the interesting year-to-year fluctuations that the RBBP sometimes picks up on. You may recall in the late 2017-18 winter, so late February 2018 into March, the beast from the east, which certainly up here where I am in Northumberland, we felt very hard, and I think in southeast England was pretty severe. In fact, I think the coldest temperature recorded during that event was in Kent. So a severe impact. And so some species like Dartford warbler, woodlark, bearded tit and little egret, resident species, were severely impacted by that. There were reports of dozens of little egrets picked up dead along strand lines in Norfolk, for example. The effect on bearded tits wasn't catastrophic. Actually, you can see larger drops due to harder winters about a decade previously, but you can see that drop, and certainly the local effects were marked. The Yare Valley, which runs east from Norwich, has reserves like RSPB Strumpshaw and so forth, had about 40 or 50 pairs of bearded tits in 2017. It had absolutely none in 2018, completely cleared out. Right, so there's some examples. And what I've probably given is an impression of wonderful monitoring and reporting on populations with no gaps. But, I have to confess that isn't the case. And there are many species on the panel's list for which our monitoring is only getting data on a fraction of the population and can't really be relied on to tell us how they're doing. Here's a list of some of the species for which we have the biggest shortfalls. Many of them are species of the north and west of Scotland, of the Highlands, of hard-to-reach places. Others are species which are possibly difficult to work on, elusive, nocturnal maybe, for example, or just, don't really attract much attention from birdwatchers. So we have these big gaps, and that's what we're plugging away at, trying to improve monitoring of some of these species. So this is the final part of my talk, where I try to exhort listeners to help us with our work, and hopefully many of you already are. So for Southeast England, here's a list of the species in our 2018 reports. It will vary from year to year, that bred within the 4 counties of Kent, Hampshire, Surrey and Sussex. So here's half of the list. I had to spread it across 2 slides. You do have a lot of rare breeding birds in the southeast of England. Your proximity to the continent, large areas of woodland coverage, some great wetland habitat, and rare habitats such as heathland mean that there's quite an extensive list. So that's the second half of the list. There are 38 species in total. I totted up before this talk. Kent takes the prize with 28 species, but hot on their heels, both Hampshire and Sussex reported 27 species of rare breeding bird in 2018. So there's we want to get some competition going and try and find some new things for future reports. Surrey, unfortunately, you are landlocked. You don't have extensive wetlands, so there were fewer, I think 17 species, but still some valuable rare breeding bird populations. So to support the work of the Rare Breeding Bird Panel, really we want people to submit records, to think of the panel and of rare breeders during the breeding season to be aware of the species we want data on. So if you see them, you make a note and report them. Possibly go a step further to follow up sightings. If you see a singing bird of a species we cover, go back to see whether it's holding a territory. Go back to see if you can find a pair or a breeding site. And submit good quality records to your local bird club, to your county bird recorders, so they reach the rare breeding bird panel. And I'll come back to that. And of course, these points about remembering the welfare of the birds themselves, and including being discreet about how you share information on exciting findings for rare breeding birds. It's very, particularly with these days of social media, very easy to share information where it's possibly not sensible to do so. In terms of quality records, what we're interested in is dates of sightings, numbers, precise location details, preferably six-figure grid references, and then what we call breeding evidence. So what was reported, what you saw about the species, so we can put that, classify breeding attempts into these three categories, same as used in bird atlasing: possible, probable, and confirmed. So if a bird is just present in suitable breeding habitat in the breeding season, we would consider that a possible breeding record, or it was singing. If there was a higher level of activity, you saw a pair, or there was a singing bird that was holding a territory on repeated dates, or you saw nest building, for example, you consider that a probable breeding record, and we want to have that information. And then finally, if you see evidence of breeding, and we consider breeding the laying of eggs, not necessarily successful breeding, it's still a confirmed breeding attempt even if a bird doesn't succeed in raising young. So if you find eggshells, you see a nest being visited with birds carrying food, or indeed you see young. This is a fantastic photo of two young purple sandpipers, the UK's only breeding purple sandpipers. This is confirmed breeding in Scotland in 2018. So that's the sort of information we want to receive. The other thing I encourage people to do, if they're really keen, is local studies, to go further, to pick a site or maybe a species that they're particularly interested in collecting more information, improving our knowledge of them. And by mentioning this gives me an excuse to show one of my favorites and a particular enthusiasm of mine at the moment. So long-eared owls, quite an elusive and hard to find species. Until recently, most years in Northumberland, where I live, there'd be somewhere between 5 and 10 pairs of long-eared owls reported every year. This time last year, with the onset of lockdown, I started cycling around the lanes near where I live in Alnwick. This is the map that's on my office wall. My wife's a teacher, so whenever I found a brood of long-eared owls, I would nick one of her merit stickers when I got home after a cycle round and put it on the map. There are 22 territories there, so far more than is normally reported in the whole county. And long-eared owls are probably present at this sort of density through much of Northumberland. It's just people haven't been looking, and so by putting some effort in and studying these fantastic birds, I've been able to improve the knowledge. Great fun that there are many other species you might be able to do this on. The other thing we try and encourage people to do is thinking back to before, this list of species where we struggle and we have poor coverage, and the fact that many of those were species of remote areas, sort of places where birdwatchers like to go on holiday. Of course, this year it looks unlikely many of us will be having foreign holidays, but fingers crossed we will get holidays. So if you're heading off somewhere, maybe you're heading up to Scotland, I'd like you to remember the Rare Breeding Bird Panel, and remember the fact that any breeding records of the species we cover while you're away from home might be of great value to us. Greenshank, actually relatively widespread across areas and quite abundant over some areas of the Highlands, but we get very few records. So if you're on a holiday in the Highlands and see a alarm calling greenshank, we really want to make sure that you submit that data to us. So again, not by emailing it to me, but sending it into the relevant county recorder. One easy way of doing that is using BirdTrack, the BTO run system for online recording. You can put records in online and they will reach the relevant county bird recorder. Or if you're like me, I use the app on my phone wherever I go, and I know that I don't have to worry about that data. I don't have to do anything else. It'll automatically get to whoever needs it. And finally, just before I wrap up, a little advert. I've advertised a book. I'll now advertise a survey. Hopefully many of you are already aware that in partnership with the RSPB, the RBBP are supporting a national turtle dove survey this year. So it's the first national survey for this rapidly declining species, the UK's fastest declining bird. I won't give great details. You can see some here. We're asking for volunteers to survey within 1 kilometre squares throughout the range. And some of the most important counties for turtle dove are in southeast England, particularly Kent, but Sussex, Hampshire have populations. There are a few in Surrey as well. Looking for 2 survey visits early in the morning. The bad news is you have to get up quite early to survey turtle doves. They get a lot quieter after 9 o'clock. The good news is you don't have to do it in bad weather. There is a URL of the website there, but you won't remember that. But if you put RSPB turtle dove survey into Google, you'll find it no problem. And here's just an example of the scatter of squares we're looking for coverage for. So those blue squares on this map are those that we're still looking for volunteers. You can go onto this interactive map, click on a square. KOS have prepared and are running their part of the survey, the Kent survey, slightly separately. So there's a different website. It's on their website. So if you go to the KOS website, you can find this map. Same thing, you can click on a square and volunteer to survey it and really help us with the first sort of stock take of this rapidly declining and threatened species. So to recap, you can help us, and hopefully I've convinced you it's worth doing. It's all fun, it's all out bird watching, so there's nothing bad about this. Making sure you submit records of RBB species to your county bird recorder with a quality record, and maybe going out of your way to find rare breeding birds and collect more information to help improve our reporting. And there's where you can find out a bit more in British Birds on our website, or you can follow us on Twitter. And on that note, and with a photo of turtle dove, just to prompt you there, I'll thank you for your time and thank SOS and the other bird clubs for the opportunity to talk to you this evening.
Thanks very much, Mark. That was brilliantly lucid and comprehensive. And it's great to have some really good news. I think we all need that in lockdown. So thanks for that. And some surprises too. I'm not sure how many people would have realised the good news on redneck phalaropes, for example. And then, you know, lots of ideas about how we can all help with your work. But without further ado, let me pass over to Tim Squire, who's a colleague of mine in the SOS, who's going to handle the Q&A. So over to you, Tim.
Thanks, Mark. Hello, Mark.
Hi.
A few questions have come in on the Q&A. If anyone wants to ask a question, please use the Q&A tab down the bottom of your screen. We've got time for a few questions. Great, really interesting talk. Thanks, Mark. The first question is from Adam, and he says, thank you for a very interesting talk. And he says, how does the data that you collect influence access to funding for conservation projects, either from the government or the third sector? And in fact, that's kind of sort of also relates to a question I had myself, which was when you're assessing species of concern, how do you take into account if a bird is rare globally, and whether then you rate it as a species of concern or not? Okay,
so I mean the first part from Adam. See if I can answer that correctly. Our data is used in a range of ways, really. I mean, that prioritization and making accessible to those who are seeking to work on particular species to support their claims for funding is one way, I guess. I mean, we're not often involved directly in sort of pitches for funding ourselves, other than for maintenance of our own work and trying to find the support to carry on what the panel does. But we're there sort of as the background, providing the evidence to be used in a range of ways. On your question, Tim, about setting priorities in the global picture, the Birds Conservation Concern Assessment uses both global assessments of threats, so Iucn Redlist assessments, the same things as, you know, pandas and tigers get threatened on. So if something is regarded as as globally threatened with extinction, it automatically goes onto the UK red list. So some of the species that are already on there, such as some of the surprises, actually, people don't realize, but puffin and velvet scoter, long-tailed skewer, so not long-tailed skewer, long-tailed duck, are on there because they're considered threatened with extinction globally, even though in the UK we might not necessarily have that much concern for some of these species. We also consider a separate assessment of European conservation status, which we're waiting. There's a new one of those being published in this spring, in May, by BirdLife Europe, and that will enable us to use that data as well. If something is considered threatened in Europe, it automatically goes onto our amber list as well. So we use these assessments, and we know there are some changes coming. I know, for example, that Leach's petrel will go on to our red list because Leach's petrel is now identified as being threatened with global extinction.
Yeah, that answers that. Yeah, thank you. That's very interesting. I have another question about Redback Strike from John Trounce. He says, why did Redback Strike drop so sharply from 1981 onwards?
I'm not sure the specifics of that, but that was the end of, yeah, if we had a proper graph for Redback Strike, it would have started a lot earlier and an awful lot higher. So we were just really seeing the last throes of our population then. So I don't know the specifics then, but it was, you know, the end of a long decline, probably related to agricultural changes, and probably particularly sharp in Redback Strikes and a group of species really that eat large invertebrates. Beetles in particular, stone curlew might be one, but when we look across Europe, nearly all of the strike species in Europe are declining. Again, if you buy that atlas I mentioned, you'll see all these declines. Things like lesser grey shrike is considered globally at risk of extinction. Roller, another species, not a shrike, but another species that eats large invertebrates, large beetles and so forth, all declining. And it seems, I think, as a food source, that's really been clobbered by changes in agriculture over many decades.
Yeah, that's right. I think you're definitely right there. So a question here from someone you might recognise. Chris Corrigan says, what are your top tips for going out looking for long-eared owls?
It's a tricky one, because the classic, the proper way to look for long-eared owls is to go out this time of year to find birds establishing territories. Because if you wait until later in the summer and you're looking for successful breeding pairs with the young, you're going to miss all those territories where they haven't been successful. But the problem is finding them this time of year is really hard. And you read the books and they'll tell you about going out on a clear light and listening for the long carrying call of hooting long-eared owls. You can't hear long-eared owls more than about 200 yards away in my experience. And I'm out most evenings at the moment when it's calm, around dusk. Really, it has to be around dusk. They do go quite rapidly after that. And I've stood in places where I know there are long-eared owls. I've seen them the previous week and I've stood there and not heard them. So you can really miss them. If you go back in June, say, not only is it a lot more pleasant to be standing around in the dark, they're really, really easy to find. So I'm sort of slightly conflicted over the advice, because you can waste a lot of time looking for them this time of year. If you go back later in the year when the young are out and they call loudly, you can hear them for nearly a kilometre in distance. And young long-eared owls call more or less throughout the whole night. I mean, I really, if the reincarnation is a thing, I really do not want to come back as an adult long-eared owl, because it must be miserable having them scream at you all night. So my advice is probably, if you're starting out, to start out by going out later in the year, looking for successful broods and getting an idea whether there are any around. My experience, small woodlands, not large woodlands. If there are tawny owls around, there are unlikely to be long-eared owls around. Seem to be some sort of exclusion going on there. Certainly up here in the north, it's small areas of scrub, conifer shelter belts, and near grassland. So not in solely arable land, at least. But we have a lot of moorland up here as well, which helps. Maybe heathland in southeast England might be an important consideration.
Thank you. Well, I'm sure Chris would be happy with that news, that he can go out when it's a bit warmer.
Yeah.
And find long-eared owls. So, thank you for that. Lucy Robertson seems to be interested in getting involved with the turtle dove survey. She asked, what level of expertise do you need to do the turtle dove survey?
Not a huge level. I mean, you have to obviously, be able to identify turtle doves, to be able to find them by call or by song, which is an important element. You'll often in these early morning surveys, it's looking for birds or trying to hear them. So, but yeah, it's pretty easy. It's very distinctive purring call that anyone can learn. The survey is also asking for people to look for a range of other interesting species, relevant species where they're out, things like grey partridge. So some broader knowledge would be useful, but really, if you feel you're able to follow the instructions to visit all suitable habitat within a 1 kilometre square early enough in the morning, and you can identify turtle doves by sight or sound, then we'd love to have you part of it, Lucy. So, hopefully you'll feel able to do that.
Thank you. Yes, get involved. It seems like you've got a few squares to fill.
Yes.
So we've got a question from Martin Garwood. He says, do local planning authorities use the red breeding bird data in relation to housing development?
We get very few requests for such data from either authorities or consultants working for them. And we do, in those instances, we do try and avoid supplying data from the panel itself, because most of the data we hold is replicated within the databases of ornithological societies and county bird clubs, or local biological record centres who work with them. And we believe it's better for those requests to be handled locally, with more local expertise around the site, at the level of recording on it. And also, if there's any funding available, some resources to pay for the provision of the data, it's better off going to local societies and those who are closer to collection of the data than us sort of taking that in elsewhere. So we do try and refer others these applications to get the data elsewhere. In fact, I've done that just this morning with an application over a dual carriageway in Scotland, and pointed them to people who will have the same data as us, but be able to provide it from a more local source.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I know the Sussex Ornithological Society, for example, will look at developments and make representations to the planning applications. Margaret asks, could you repeat the location of the Mediterranean gull in Hampshire, where they're breeding?
It's the RSPB reserve at Langston Harbour.
Thank you.
Which I've not been to. For the last time I went there, it was before Mediterranean gulls, but it must be a magnificent sight when they're all in the summer.
Yeah. Question from Tom Ensign. He says he's using the eBird app. Does data from that go through to you?
Variably. So we rely on, same as BirdTrack really, we rely on county bird recorders accessing that data to include in whatever they receive from other sources. Some bird clubs nowadays are using BirdTrack as their core system and asking for records to be submitted that way. And it seems rather variable over whether county recorders are using eBird data. It depends from county to county whether they see many of their local bird watchers are using the system, and so if they don't use it, they don't get the records. And there are, I think, still some teething problems over recorders being able to access data, though eBird do make it available in some cases. I know bird clubs have had problems getting hold of the relevant data, so it's not guaranteed. If you put a record into BirdTrack, I'm more or less certain it will make its way through to me eventually. eBird not happening as smoothly as it can, but there's ongoing discussions between eBird and BirdTrack, for example, about data sharing, and hopefully these data flows will become a bit more seamless in the future.
That'd be good, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Interesting question here from Adam, who says, how does the number of species on the RBBP list compare to when records began in the 1970s?
We had a much smaller, well, I say, wasn't me, obviously. I got a few grey hairs, but not. So it was a much shorter list because the panel just concentrated on really rare birds back then. I'm not actually sure whether they had a strictly defined threshold like we have, or relatively strictly, but they had a shorter list of things with populations in certainly no more than a few hundred. It was only in 1986 which we opened up the list to a wider range of species, took the threshold up to about 2,000. So that was why, for example, the quail graph I showed only started in 1986, because we added it on then. And now we just maintain it every year. We look at whether things like Mediterranean gull are getting too common. We'll be having the same discussion about avocet, I think, soon, about taking that off. And we look at things like willow tit or turtle dove as they decline and try and work out whether they've become rare enough. Sometimes we have species on we don't even really know what the population is. We've just added crested tit onto the list because we think the population may be less than 2,000, but we really don't know. So hopefully by collecting information for a few years, we'll be able to make a better assessment. We might chuck it off again, but we'll have to see.
Kevin Sayer asks, will you be automatically including recently introduced species such as white-tailed eagle and osprey on the list? We're now seeing white-tailed eagles regularly in Hampshire.
So we don't make a distinction between the source. So we cover osprey and white-tailed eagle already. Osprey for a native population, white-tailed eagle for the populations coming from the reintroductions back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So we don't distinguish between sources, and we won't collect those. So we will collect information on new populations of ospreys, and it may take a while for birds to mature and establish where they're going to breed. But hopefully, if the reintroduction into Hampshire, Isle of Wight, is successful and birds establish, and possibly another one might be coming in Norfolk soon, if they're successful and birds are breeding, then we will be collecting information and including that in our reporting. Same as we did for crane, for example, with the crane reintroduction.
Yeah, once they become established. Thanks. And I've got a question here. Can't remember who asked it now. Kevin. No. About Blythe's reed warbler. Any Blythe's reed warblers recorded in 1990 or 2019? So
we're seeing increasing numbers of Blythe's reed warbler. 2020 isn't a year, not received because of those lags in data receiving. I'm not chasing people for 2020 data yet. I've not received much, but I know that there were lots of records of singing male Blythe's reed warbler. It was probably the best year ever. There were some established territories and sang for quite a long time. There was one on my local patch in Northumberland which sang for only half an hour and disappeared before I could get down there, so a bit frustrated. So yeah, there will be, as far as I know, there's nothing more than that. There was nothing more than lone males singing. But again, thank you for the opportunity. I can plug the book again, the European Breeding Atlas. If you look at the map for Blythe's reed warbler in there, the change map shows a remarkable expansion. This is not just something that's happening in UK. They have moved westward right across Scandinavia, including proper breeding, getting much closer. So I think if that continues any longer, we could anticipate proper breeding attempts of Blythe's reed warbler any time now.
Right, that'd be interesting. I think we've probably got time for one last question. Mark, if you want to come in at any point and tell us to stop. There's Simon Stacey asked, if goshawk is on the up, could this be a good sign for smaller woodland birds because they will predate corvids? Interesting.
Possibly, I don't know. I'll have to admit, I'm not a great expert on goshawks. I think it's possibly bad news for grey squirrels, which could be good news for woodland birds as much as corvids. Obviously, the superabundance of pheasants. Yeah, and I should whisper it really because not everyone likes goshawks, and people who like pheasants don't tend to like goshawks. But the superabundance of pheasants through much of the UK is quite possibly supporting the increase in goshawks, as is our burgeoning and still increasing wood pigeon population. One of the few species that really benefited from modern agricultural changes is probably helping our goshawk population as well. So yeah, there's various potential ecological ramifications from ever increasing goshawks, and they do look set to expand and increase further still. But I wouldn't want to guess at all of them.
Great.
No.
Tim, I better come in again, I think.
Right, over to you.
Thank you, Tim, for posing the questions. And Mark, thank you very much again from all 4 societies. I think many of us will want to reflect on the ideas and suggestions that you've given us about how we can help with the panel's work. And to everybody listening, do please contact the relevant county recorder if you'd like to help and want some suggestions about how best to do so. On eBird, you need to ask the relevant recorder in Sussex. We certainly do get eBird data, but it is problematic sometimes. If you're not a member of any of the 4 societies, do please consider joining the relevant one or making a donation. You can find out how to do that on our websites. So again, thank you very much indeed, Mark, for that incredibly well-informed and inspiring talk. It's great to have so much good news and so many ideas about how we can all help in conservation. Thanks very much indeed. The next SOS talk goes about 6,000 miles east to Afghanistan. But thank you all very much indeed. Mark, thank you again.
My pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.